everyone, this is Hafizullah Masoudi and you're watching From Code with Hafiz. I welcome you to the fifth video of this series where we will discuss CSS margins, CSS padding, CSS height and width and CSS box model. So first of all, what are CSS margins? Well, margins are used to create space around elements outside of any defined borders. Now with CSS you have full control over the margins. There are properties for setting a margin for each side of an element: top, right, bottom and left. So we have a property for margin top, margin right, margin bottom and margin left. Now note that all margin properties can have their values auto, which leaves the browser to calculate the margin, and it can have the value in length, which can be specified in pixels, points, centimeters, em, etc. And it can have its value in percentage, which specifies a margin and percentage of the width of the containing element. And finally it can inherit the value which specifies the margin should be inherited from the parent element. Now for margins you can also declare values in negative values, so keep this one in mind too. Now to show you some examples in our Visual Studio Code, let's first of all create a paragraph. So I will create a paragraph here, and for this one let's say this is a paragraph, and if we check this out in the browser now, so let's check it out. Now you can see it's showing like this, but let's assign some margin to this paragraph. So in our style tag let's target the p tag, and in here let's declare margin top. So let's say 100 pixels, and let's say margin bottom, and let's say 100 pixels, and let's say margin right. So this one should be 150 pixels for example, and let's say margin left, and let's say 80 pixels. So if we save this now, get back to the browser and refresh, now you can see the paragraph is having some margin. Now CSS provides a shorthand margin property too, to shorten the code, and it makes it possible to specify all the margin properties in one property. So the margin shorthand property can take from 1 to 4 values. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and what I will do is now I will comment this, and first of all let's declare the shorthand property. So we can say margin, and then if we declare this one for example 100px, so all the 4 sides will get the same margin. So if I go to the browser now, refresh, so the top, left, bottom and right, so all the sides will get the same margin. So if this value is 2, so let's say 200px here. Now the first one is for the top and bottom, and the second one is for the left and right. So if we save this, get back to the browser, now see if I when I refresh, the top would be the same, but the left and right will change. So if I refresh, now you can see the left and right margin is now more than the top and bottom. So if the value is 3 value, so let's say in here 100px, and let's make the first one for example 50px. So if we save this, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see the sides are 200, the top is 50 and the bottom is 100 pixels. So if the value is 4 values, so let's say in here 400 pixels. So now what this means is that the first one is top, second one is right, third one is bottom, and the fourth one is left. So if we save this, get back to the browser and refresh, now you can see our fourth value, which is the left side, has increased. Now next up what we have is the margin value auto, which will horizontally center the element within its container. The element will then take up the specified width, and the remaining space will be split equally between the left and right margins. So let me show you an example, guys. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and what I will do is I will create a div here. So let's create a div, and inside the div I will put nothing. So let's style the div, and let's say div, and we want the width of this div for example 300 px, and for margin let's say auto, and for border let's declare some border, so 1 px, and solid red. Now if we save this, the div should be in center of the page horizontally. So let's get back to the browser and refresh. Now you can see it's in center, which means that margin auto is working just fine. So let's declare some text inside this div to see this better. So let's say this is a div. Now let's save this, get back to the browser. Yeah, now you can see it's horizontally centered. Now next up we have the margin value inherit, which lets the margin of an element be inherited from the parent element. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and what I will do is at the top of other elements I will create a div first. So let's create a div, and let's say this is a div, and let's create a paragraph here, and for this one let's say this is another paragraph. Let's comment this other code, and let's also comment this code, or let's remove it, guys, because we don't need it. So first of all let's declare some styling for the div. So let's say we want to give some border to this div, 1 px, solid, and let's say red, and let's say margin left. So let's say margin left should be 100 px, and now let's style the paragraph. So for paragraph, what I will do is, for now if we go to the browser and refresh, for now you can see this div is getting the left margin, but nothing inside the div is getting the margin. So for the paragraph, if I say margin left and I want to say inherit, now it will take margin left 100 pixels. So let's get back to the browser, and if I refresh, now you can see it's inheriting the same amount of margin left that we gave to the div. So guys, sometimes what we have is that sometimes two margins collapse into a single margin. Now this happens sometimes with top and bottom margins of elements, that they collapse into a single margin. This does not happen on left and right margins, it only happens with the top and the bottom margins. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code. So let's say h1, and let's say this is header 1, and let's create an h2. So let's say this is header 2, and now let's design it. So for the h1 I want to declare some margin. So let's say margin bottom, and let's say 50 pixels. And next up we have h2. So for this one I want a margin top, so let's say 20 pixels. Now if you go to the browser and if I refresh, now you can see between both of them we have some kind of margin. But what do you think that how much this margin will be? So if we look at our code, so we have the bottom margin for h1 50 and the top margin for h2 20. So the common sense would seem to suggest that the vertical margin between the h1 and the h2 would be total of 70 pixels. So 50 plus 20 will be 70. But due to margin collapse, the actual margin ends up being 50 pixels. So this is something you should notice and consider always being in situations like this. So if you have a bottom and top margin at the same time, so consider that it will collapse, and to not get confused, so why it's not getting all the margin. Now this was all about margins. Next up we have CSS padding. So padding is used to create a space around an element's content inside of any defined borders. With CSS you have full control over the padding, and there are properties for setting the padding for each side of an element. so top, right, bottom and left sides. So we have padding top, padding right, padding bottom and padding left, and all the padding properties can have their values in length, which can be specified in pixels, points, centimeters, em, etc. And in percentage you can also declare its value, so it will get a percentage of the width of the containing element. And then finally we have the inherit value, which specifies the padding should inherit from the parent element. So you can also give the padding negative values, so keep this in mind. Now to declare some examples, let's remove all of this code from here, and I will remove this one also. So let's leave the div, so we will work on it. Now for the div, if we go to the browser now and refresh, so this is our div, and in here if we target this div, now first of all let's declare some border for it, so 1px solid red, and if we refresh, now you can see, so it's having no padding. So what we can do is give it some padding, so let's say padding top, and let's say 50 pixels, and we can give it padding right, so 30 pixels let's say, and let's say padding bottom, so 50 pixels again, and let's say padding left and 80 pixels. Now if I save this, get back to the browser, and if I refresh, now you can see the div is having some padding inside its border. So CSS provides a shorthand padding property also to shorten the code, and it makes it possible to specify all the padding properties in one property. So the padding shorthand property can take from 1 to 4 values, same as we explained for the margin. So if the value is a 1 value, the padding will get the same padding value, and if the value is 2 values, so the first one would be top and bottom, and the second one would be right and left. And if it has 3 values, the first one will be top, second one will be left and right, and the third one will be bottom. And if it has 4 values, so you already know that one for top, second for right, third for bottom, and the fourth one will be for left padding value. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and instead of all of this code, let's first comment this, and what we can do is we can just declare the shorthand padding property. So the first value should be, let's say 50 pixel, and the second one, which is the right, we can say 30 pixels, and the third one is bottom, so 50 pixels, and the fourth one is left, so 80 pixels. So we should get our padding as it was before. So let's get back to the browser, and if I refresh, you can see it's still getting the same padding. Now suppose guys that an element has width is specified, so the padding added to that element will be added to the total width of the element, and this is often an undesirable result. So suppose the element has a 300 pixel width and define 25 pixel padding, so the actual width of the element will be 350 pixels. So 300 pixel width, 25 pixel right padding, and 25 pixel left padding. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and what I will do is for the padding in here I will say 25 pixels, and let's declare some width for this. So width should be, let's say 300 pixels, and if you go to the browser now, refresh, so for now it's not getting the width of 300 pixels. Well, the padding is also added, so it is taking a total of 350 width. Now to keep the width in its initialized size, which is 300 pixels, we can use a property called box sizing, which causes the element to maintain its actual width. If you increase the padding, the available content space will decrease, and then so to show you this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and in here we can just declare another property, which is box sizing, and we want this one to be border box. So now the padding will be counted inside the width. So to show you this one, If I refresh, now the width should become a little bit smaller. So if you refresh, now you can see it's taking its initialized size, which is 300 pixels. So this was all about CSS padding. Next up we have CSS height and width. So the CSS height and width properties are used to set the height and width of an element. Now note that the height and width properties do not include padding, borders or margins. It sets the height and width of the area inside the padding, border and margin of an element. So the height and the width properties can take an auto value, which is the default value, and let the browser calculate the height or width. And second, it can take length values, which can be defined in pixels, centimeters, etc. And third, it can take percentage values, which defines the height and width in percentage of the containing block. And next up, it can take initial value, which sets the height and width to its default value. And finally, it can inherit a value from its parent value. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let me clear all of this code. And now let's declare some height for this div. So let's say 200 px, and let's declare some width for it, so 50%, and let's say background color should be powder blue. So if I save this, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see the height is 200 pixels and is taking 50% of the width of its parent element. Now note that the height and width properties do not include padding, borders or margins. Now we have max and min properties also for both height and width. So we have the max height property and min height property, which defines the maximum and the minimum height for an element. And for the width, we also have max width and min width properties, which defines the maximum and minimum width for an element. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code. So instead of height, we have max hyphen height. So it will define the maximum height that this div can take. And for the width, we also have max hyphen width. So this will be the value or the maximum value that this div can only take. So it will not exceed from this value, which is 50%. Now for minimum, we can just say min hyphen height, and for the width we also have min hyphen width. So this was all about CSS height and width. Finally we have the box model. So all HTML elements can be considered as boxes. So in CSS, the term box model is used when talking about design and layout. Now the CSS box model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element, and it consists of margins, borders, padding and the actual content. So to show you an example, I will open an image now. So in this image you can see that the content of the box is where text and images appear, and then we have the padding, which clears an area around the content, and the padding is transparent. And then we have the border, which goes around the padding and content. And finally we have the margin, which clears an area outside the border, and the margin is also transparent. So to show you an example of this one, let me clear this styling from here. So for this one we can define a width, and let's say 300 pixels, and we can define a border for it, so 15 pixel, let's say 15 pixels, solid and green. And then we can declare a padding for it, so let's say 50 pixels, and let's declare a margin also, so 20 pixels. Now if we save this, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see this is the actual content. Then we have the padding, as you remember in the image, and then we have this border, and finally we have this margin. So this is the box model. So this was everything about CSS margins, CSS padding, CSS height and width, and CSS box model. I hope you enjoyed watching the video and it was informative. If so, don't forget to give the thumbs up and a nice comment also. And if you are new to this channel, Don't forget to subscribe too if you want more videos like this. So thanks for watching. See ya in the next video.